Earl Decker was 70 years old on the day the sheriff's deputy put his belongings on the sidewalk outside the Pineview Apartments in Hartwell, Oregon. Two boxes, a duffel bag, a folding chair. Earl stood on that sidewalk in the October rain and looked at it all. His German shepherd, Hatch, pressed against his leg. The dog was 9 years old and his muzzle had gone mostly gray. Earl put his hand on the dog's head. He had $40 in his wallet, a quarter tank of bum, and nowhere he needed to be. He loaded everything into the truck and drove north on Highway 14 because north was away. He had no plan. He did not know yet that Hatch had one. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today? The apartment had been Earl's for 6 years. Room 4 at the Pineview. One bedroom, a small kitchen, a bathroom where the hot water took 2 minutes to come. It was not much. Earl had never needed much. He had come back from Vietnam in 1971 with a Purple Heart and a piece of shrapnel lodged near his right hip that the surgeons had decided was safer to leave than to take out. He had worked 30 years in the timber industry, mostly as a surveyor, walking cut lines through the Oregon forest with a compass and a notebook. He had been good at it. He had been good at being alone in the trees. When the industry changed and the surveys went digital, and the younger men came in with GPS units and software, Earl had retired at 62 and moved into the Pineview with very little money and very little noise. His wife Doris had died of cancer in 2009. His daughter Claire lived in Denver and called on Sundays when she remembered. There was no bitterness in that. It was just how things had settled. Earl had Hatch, who had come from the county shelter 8 years ago as a skinny 1-year-old with big ears and a limp from a healed fracture nobody had explained. The limp had faded. The ears had stayed big. Hatch was the kind of dog who paid attention to the world very seriously, like it was in mind he had been given and intended to do well. The eviction had been coming. Earl had known it was coming, the way you know a storm is coming, when the light changes in the afternoon and the birds go quiet. The landlord was a man named Portis who had bought the Pineview 2 years ago and had been raising rents and finding reasons to end leases ever since. Earl's lease had ended in August. Portis had not renewed it. He had sent a notice instead, a legal one, properly stamped, and Earl had called a legal aid number he found in the phone book, and the woman on the line had been kind but clear. There was nothing to contest. The lease was up. Portis had the right. Earl had asked about veteran housing programs. The woman had given him 3 numbers. He had called them all. 2 were no longer in service. The third had a wait list of 14 months. He had put his name on the list. He was still on it when the deputy came with a notice to vacate. The deputy was a young man with a short haircut, and he was not unkind about it. He had stood to the side while Earl carried his things down. He had helped with the second box without being asked. When everything was on the sidewalk, he had said, "Sir, is there someone I can call for you?" Earl had looked at him. "No," Earl said. "Thank you." The deputy had nodded and gone back to his cruiser. He sat there for a while before he drove away. Earl appreciated that. It meant the young man understood that sometimes a person needs a moment. Hatch had sat beside the boxes on the wet sidewalk and watched the street. His ears moved at every passing car. His tail did not wag. He seemed to understand the weight of it. Earl loaded the truck slowly. His bad hip ached in the rain. The shrapnel shifted sometimes in cold, wet weather, a deep pressure that no painkiller quite reached. He did not rush. He loaded everything, shut the tailgate, and stood by the driver's door for a moment. He looked up at the building. Room 4 was on the second floor. The window was dark now. He had put curtains on that window his first week there. Yellow curtains because Doris had always liked yellow in a window. He had taken the curtains when he packed. They were in the box in the truck. He got in. Hatch was already in the passenger seat. The dog looked at him with amber eyes, calm, steady, present. "All right," Earl said. His voice was rough. Hatch's tail moved once against the seat. Earl started the truck and drove north. Highway 14 goes north out of Hartwell, through low farmland, and then climbs into the Coast Range, where the trees get tall fast and the fog comes down from the ridges in the afternoon and the road gets narrow and wet and serious. Earl had driven it many times in his surveying years. He drove it now without thinking much, just going. the way you go when the thinking is too much and the moving is easier. The rain was steady. The wipers needed replacing. They left a smear across the lower quarter of the windshield that Earl had to lean slightly to see past. Hatch sat up straight in the passenger seat and watched the road with great concentration, as if he were navigating. The dog's ears rotated at sounds Earl couldn't hear over the engine. At some point, Earl realized he was crying. Not loudly, just a slow leak around the eyes, the kind that comes when the body decides it's time regardless of what you think about it. He let it go. There was no one to see it but Hatch, and Hatch never judged. The dog glanced at him and pressed his shoulder against Earl's arm. They drove for 2 hours. The farmland gave way to second-growth timber, and then the second growth gave way to older trees, the big Douglas firs that started a few miles past the Benton County line. Trees that were 80 and 90 feet tall, their crowns lost in the fog. Earl had spent years in country like this. He knew how to read it. He knew the difference between land that had been worked and land that had been left alone. Out past the ridge on the right side of the highway, the trees had that particular look of old, undisturbed forest. No stumps, no slash, no roads cutting in. Just trees and understory and the dark spaces between. He did not know why he noticed it, especially then. Maybe he was just looking for something to notice. He had been driving for about 20 minutes past a small pullout when Hatch stood up on the seat. The dog did not bark. He pressed his nose to the passenger the window and then moved across to Earl's side and pressed his nose to the driver's window instead. His tail was moving fast. "What is it?" Earl said. Hatch whined. One short, low note. He looked at Earl and then back at the driver's window. "You need out?" Earl said. Hatch made the sound again. Earl pulled off onto the gravel shoulder and stopped. He opened his door. Hatch went right across his lap and out the driver's door before Earl had fully stepped out, which at 70 with a bad hip was a thing that required coordination. Earl steadied himself on the doorframe. Hatch was already at the tree line. He stood there with his nose in the air, reading something in the wet wind that came down from the ridge. His whole posture had changed. This was not a dog who needed to relieve himself. This was a bush who had found something. "Hatch," Earl said. The dog looked back at him. His eyes were bright. His tail was moving. He took 3 steps into the tree line and stopped and looked back again. Earl stood on the gravel shoulder of Highway 14 with the rain coming down and the trucks going past at 60 miles an hour and looked at his dog standing at the edge of the old forest. He looked for a long time. He had known this dog for 8 years. He had watched him in the woods on dozens of survey walks Earl had taken just for the habit of it, just to stay in the trees where he felt most like himself. He knew what Hatch looked like when he was following something real. This was that. Earl went to the truck and got his jacket and his flashlight. He locked the truck. He put his hand on Hatch's back. The dog moved into the trees and Earl followed. There was a trail, not a maintained one, a ghost of a trail, the kind that used to be something and had been slowly reclaimed over decades by fern and salal and fallen branches. But the line of it was still there if you knew how to look. The ground held the memory of use the way old wood holds the memory of a hand, a faint compression, a parting of the understory, a slight clarity in the canopy overhead where nothing had grown back quite as thick. Earl had spent 30 years reading ground like this. He saw it immediately. Hatch moved along it with confidence, nose down, not ranging or exploring, but tracking, purposeful, moving at a steady pace just fast enough that Earl had to push himself. His hip was tight in the cold. He focused on his breathing and his footing. The rain filtered through the canopy and came down in slow drops, not a shower anymore, just the after drip of it, cold and soft. The ferns were enormous out here, head high in places, dark green, the fronds brushing his jacket as he walked. The big firs closed overhead and the light went down to a green-gray, the particular color of old forest in wet weather that Earl had always found more restful than any room he had ever slept in. They walked for 20 minutes. The trail bent left around a long, rocky outcropping and went up for a stretch, steep enough that Earl put his hand on the rock face to steady himself. His breath came hard at the top. He stood for a moment. Hatch waited. The dog sat and watched him catch his breath without impatience. "I'm coming," Earl said. Hatch's tail moved. They went on. The trail leveled out on a bench of land, a flat shelf in the hillside about 200 feet above the highway that Earl could no longer hear at all. The forest here was different. The trees were older, much older. Earl stopped and looked up, firs that were 3, 4 feet across at the base, the kind of trees that were here before anyone now alive was born. They rose straight up into the fog and disappeared. The understory was open beneath them, the way it is in old growth where the canopy is thick enough that nothing much grows below. The ground was soft with a century of needles. Hatch had gone ahead. Earl heard him stop and then heard the walk make a sound he had not heard before. Not a bark, not a whine, a low sound somewhere between them, a sound that meant something specific, something that Earl felt in his chest before he processed it in his mind. He came around a deadfall Douglas fir, a giant that had come down long ago and now lay decomposing in a long green mound covered in moss and fern, and he stopped. There was a building. It sat in a natural clearing in the old growth, a long, low structure of vertical logs and a metal roof gone orange with rust. A covered porch ran the length of the front. The porch roof had held. The building itself was standing solid, not leaning, not collapsed. The windows were intact, covered on the inside with wooden shutters. A painted sign above the door, the paint mostly gone, the letters still legible in the pale wood beneath. USFS District 7, Ranger Station. Earl stood and looked at it. The fog moved slowly through the clearing. The big firs stood around the station like walls. No one had been here in a very long time. No one had been here in longer than Earl could estimate from where he stood. Hatch was on the porch. The dog looked back at him, and his tail was moving steadily. "All right," Earl said. He walked to the porch. The door was not locked. It had a latch, the kind with a simple iron bar, and the bar had rusted in the raised position and would not lower. The door itself had swelled in the weather until it was tight in the frame. Earl put his shoulder against it and pushed. On the second push it gave with a sound like a held breath releasing and swung inward. The smell came out first. Dry, woody, the particular smell of a space that has been sealed for a long time, not rot, not mildew, something cleaner than that. Cedar underneath. The interior walls had been lined with cedar planking. Earl stood in the doorway and waited for his eyes to adjust. The shuttered windows let in lines of gray light at the edges. He used his flashlight. One large main room, a long table of heavy timber down the center, 8 chairs, most still standing. A wood stove in the corner, iron, the good kind, the kind that was built to be used hard and last. Against the far wall, floor-to-ceiling shelving, the shelves holding row after row of objects. Hatch moved inside and went directly to the stove. He sniffed along the base of it and then came back to Earl's side. His ears were relaxed now. His tail moved slowly. He was satisfied. This was where he had been trying to go. Earl moved to the shelving. He brought the flashlight close. The shelves held supplies arranged with the care of someone who knew these things might need to last. Canned goods, dozens of them. Commercial cans, the big ones, sealed. The paper labels had mostly disintegrated, but the cans themselves were intact. Metal tins with tight lids, flour, sugar, salt, the kind that held if sealed right. Matches in a metal box, kerosene lanterns, 4 of them, hanging on hooks above the shelves. A medical kit in a green metal case. Tools, hand tools, a draw knife, a felling axe, a bow saw, all hanging on the wall to his left, oiled and wrapped in cloth against rust. Earl moved through the room slowly. He opened the shutters on 2 of the windows. The light came in soft and gray, and the room opened up. It was larger than it had seemed. There was a sleeping area at the back, partitioned by a half wall of cedar planking, with 4 wooden bunks, 2 to each wall, and on each bunk a folded canvas bedroll, dust-covered but intact. A wood table in the sleeping area held a kerosene lamp and a wash basin. Earl went back to the main room. He found a door at the back left corner. He opened it. Outside, 10 feet from the back wall, was a well, a proper hand pump well, the kind sunk deep with a cast iron pump handle. Earl worked the handle. Stiff. He worked it again. slower, longer strokes. On the fourth stroke, water came. It was brown at first, just the sitting water in the pipe, and then it went clear, cold and clean. He cupped his hand under it and tasted. Good water, iron and minerals, and cold and clean. He stood at the well with the cold water running over his hand and looked up through the old firs at the gray sky. The rain had stopped. Somewhere high up in the canopy, a Steller's jay was calling, sharp and insistent. Hatch came around the corner of the building and pushed his nose under Earl's hand. The dog's nose was wet and cold. Good water, Earl told him. Hatch's tail moved. Earl went back inside. He found the lanterns, and one of them had kerosene still in the reservoir, old but present. It lit on the third match. The warm light spread across the room and made the cedar walls glow. Earl sat down at the long timber table in that warm light and put his flashlight down and looked at the room around him. The room had been someone's work. Someone had built this and stocked it and maintained it and used it. It was not abandoned in the way of a place that had been given up on. It was more like a place that had been waiting. There was something else on the table. Earl had not noticed it at first in the dark. A large metal document tube, the kind surveyors use, olive drab, U.S. Forest Service stenciled on the side. The end cap was screwed on tight. It took him both hands and a piece of cloth for grip to open it. Inside were maps, survey maps of the district, rolled and folded. They came out in sequence when he tilted the tube, and with them, at the back of the tube, a manila envelope, sealed with a metal clasp and dated in the upper corner in faded black ink. The date read September 14th, 1961. Earl set the maps aside and opened the envelope. Inside was not a letter, not a personal document. It was a land designation order. 3 pages, official Forest Service stationery, stamped and countersigned. Earl read it once and then read it again. He had spent 30 years reading survey documents and legal land descriptions. He understood what he was reading. In 1958, as part of a post-war federal program for veteran resettlement, 2,300 acres of land in this district had been designated for veteran families. The station was to serve as the administrative center for the program. The program had lost funding in 1961 and had been administratively suspended, not canceled, suspended, pending reallocation. The land had never been transferred back to General Forest Service management. It had never been reclaimed. It sat in the federal records in a status that in land law is sometimes called quiet title, not abandoned, not active, simply unclaimed, in suspension, waiting for a process to complete that never had. Earl put the document down on the table. He sat with his hands flat on the wood. The lantern made a warm circle around him. Hatch came and lay across his feet. The dog's weight was warm and solid and real. Earl looked at the lantern flame. It was straight and still. The forest outside was absolutely quiet. He thought about what the document meant. He thought about it practically, carefully, the way a surveyor thinks, in terms of lines and records and what can be followed up and what cannot. He did not let himself hope too fast. He had learned not to hope too fast. But he did not look away from what was in front of him. A flash came then without warning. The lantern flame flickered once, and for a moment the light changed and the cedar walls were gone. The air was hot and smelled of diesel and something burning. He was in a ditch in the Quang Tri province, and the tree line was lit up, and Morrison was yelling something, and the radio was gone, and the ground was shaking. Earl's hands pressed hard against the table. His chest was tight. His breathing was fast. Hatch was up instantly. The dog pressed his full weight against Earl's legs. He pushed his head hard up under Earl's hands. The cold damp of the mall's nose against Earl's palms. The weight of him, solid and present and here. Earl gripped the dog's fur. His breathing slowed. The cedar walls came back. The lantern flame was straight. The forest was quiet. Hatch leaned into him and did not move. "Okay," Earl said. His voice came out thin. He cleared it. "Okay." He put both hands on the dog's back and held on for a moment. Then he let go slowly. Hatch stayed pressed against his leg. Earl looked back at the document on the table. He picked it up and read the third page again. There was a process for claim. There always was. There was a contact office listed. The office number had changed in 60 years, but offices had successors. Land records did not disappear. He had enough to start. He folded the document back into the envelope and held it. "Hatch," he said. The dog looked up at him. His amber eyes were steady in the lantern light. "I think your mother knew something I didn't," Earl said. Hatch's tail moved slowly on the floor. Earl slept at the station that first night. There was no decision to it. His truck was on the highway shoulder. His hip was telling him plainly it was done with distances for the day, and the bunk in the back room had a canvas bedroll that was stiff with age but whole. He lit the wood stove with dry cedar from a box beside it. Someone had left tinder and starter wood, everything you needed. And the stove drew well, the chimney clear, and the room warmed within an hour. He ate crackers and a tin of meat from his provisions in the truck that he went and got before dark, while there was still gray light on the trail. Hatch had a bowl and his kibble. They ate at the long table by lantern light. The forest outside was absolutely dark by 7 o'clock. The kind of dark that city people never experience, where there is no ambient light from anywhere, where you hold your hand in front of your face and see nothing. Earl found this restful. He always had. He lay on the bunk and listened to the forest. The stove ticked as it cooled. Somewhere outside an owl called and called again, patient and clear. Hatch lay on the floor beside the bunk. The dog's breathing slowed and deepened as he fell asleep. Earl looked at the ceiling of the station, old cedar boards, and thought about the document in the manila envelope. He was not a fool. He knew that a 63-year-old designation order did not automatically become anything. He knew there would be processes, offices, bureaucracies, people who would not know what he was talking about, people who would tell him the record had been superseded, people who would transfer him and lose him in hold music. He had dealt with the VA for 40 years. He understood how these things worked, but he also knew land law. He had worked alongside government surveyors for decades. He knew that quiet title cases had been won on far older and far more ambiguous documents than the one in that tube. He knew that federal land designations, once made, carried a legal weight that was very hard to fully extinguish without explicit cancellation. And the 1961 document said very clearly, suspended, not canceled, not terminated, suspended. He thought about that word for a long time before he fell asleep. He drove back to Hartwell the next morning and went to the public library. He needed a computer and he needed quiet, and the library gave him both. He spent 3 hours on federal land records databases, following chains of title and administrative history for District 7. The librarian, a woman in her 50s named Pat, who had a sharp face and reading glasses on a lanyard, came and looked over his shoulder once without being asked and said, "Federal land records?" "Trying to trace a designation," Earl said. "I know those systems a little," she said. "My husband worked for BLM for 20 years. "I could use the help," Earl said. He was not a man who asked for help easily, but he was also not a man who refused it out of pride when it was offered genuinely. Pat pulled up a chair. They worked through it together for another hour. What they found confirmed what Earl had suspected. The 1958 designation was still on record. It had never been formally rescinded. It appeared in one administrative review in 1978 as an outstanding item, flagged for resolution, and then appeared to have been simply filed away when the reviewer retired. It was the kind of thing that happened in large bureaucracies. Something got set aside once and then set aside again and eventually became invisible through accumulation of time. "You'd need a lawyer," Pat said, "someone who does federal land claims." "I know," Earl said. "This is worth talking to someone about, though," she said. She looked at the screen. She looked at him. "This is genuinely worth pursuing." That was the second time in 2 days someone had done something small that meant a great deal. Earl thanked her. He drove back up to the station in the afternoon. Hatch rode with his nose out the window, reading the air. When they pulled off the highway and Earl said, "Let's go, boy," the dog was out of the truck before Earl had his jacket on and was standing at the tree line waiting. Earl called a number from a card that James Pryor at the VFW Hall in Hartwell had given him once, years ago, saying, "If you ever need anything." The man's name was Carver, and he worked for a legal nonprofit out of Portland that handled veteran affairs cases. He listened to Earl for 10 minutes without interrupting. Then he asked two questions, both of them precise and legal, about the specific wording of the suspension order. Earl read him the relevant passages. Carver was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Decker," he said, "I'd like to see that document in person." "You can come out here," Earl said. "I'll be here." There was a short pause. "Are you living out there?" Carver said. "For now," Earl said. Another pause. "All right," Carver said. "I can be there Thursday." Carver came on Thursday as he said he would. He was a lean man in his 40s, waterproof jacket and hiking boots, who shook Earl's hand firmly and did not comment on the living situation, which Earl respected immediately. He read the documents at the long table. He asked questions about the land. He took photographs of the pages with his phone. He walked the perimeter of the clearing with a small GPS unit and asked Earl questions about the tree line and the survey markers, which Earl could answer because he had spent the morning walking the area the way he used to walk cut lines. Reading the ground, finding the old corner stakes that were still in the soil if you knew where to look for the iron. They were still there, 40, 50 years old and still there. "You know surveying," Carver said. "I do," Earl said. Hatch was beside them the whole time, moving between the two men, keeping proximity. Carver looked at the dog once and said, "Good dog." Hatch's tail moved once in acknowledgement, and then he went back to monitoring. That afternoon, a truck came up the trail. It was passable to vehicles, barely, Earl had found, and the truck belonged to a man named Bud Tolliver, who logged the private land 2 miles north. He had seen Earl's truck on the shoulder days ago and had been curious. He came in a non-threatening way, slowly, windows down. He was about 60, a thick man with a gray beard and the particular posture of someone who has worked outdoors his whole life. He looked at the station and at Earl and at Carver and at Hatch, and he said, "I'll be damned, old District 7 station." "You know it?" Earl said. "My father talked about it," Tolliver said. "He did trail maintenance up here in the 60s. Said there was a ranger station the Forest Service just forgot about." He got out of the truck and walked around the building slowly, running his hand along the log walls. "It's solid," he said. "Someone built this to last." "They did," Earl said. Tolliver looked at him. "What are you going to do with it?" "Whatever I can," Earl said. Tolliver nodded slowly. He looked at the big firs around the clearing. He looked at the well. "My father was a veteran," and he said, "Korea." "Mine was too," Earl said. They stood there in the clearing for a moment. The forest was quiet around them. A light wind came down from the ridge and moved the tops of the firs very slowly. "I know people who know this kind of country," Tolliver said. "People who know how to work wood and stone. If you get your feet under you here legally, you might find some help." Earl looked at him. "I'll keep that in mind," he said. 2 weeks later, Carver called from Portland. The preliminary filing had been accepted by the Regional Federal Land Office. The claim was active. It would take time. These things always took time, but the legal foundation was sound. The suspension order had never been properly closed out. The designation was in the records. Carver said there was historical precedent for exactly this kind of claim. He said there was a federal process for it, and he intended to use it. He said Earl should stay on the land and document his presence and his work there, because continuous occupation supported the claim. "Stay there and make it real," Carver said. "That's the job right now." "I can do that," Earl said. He was standing outside the station when he took the call. The afternoon light was low and came through the firs at a long angle. Gold, the kind of light that makes everything look like it was painted. The big trees stood in it quietly. The wood smoke from the stove came out of the chimney straight up because there was no wind. The well water was in a bucket by the back door. Hatch was lying in a patch of sunlight on the porch, his chin on his paws, his eyes half closed. He opened them when Earl ended the call and came to the porch. The dog looked at him. Earl sat on the edge of the porch. His hip ached. The shrapnel shifted in the cold and he breathed through it slowly the way he had learned to do. He looked out at the clearing. He looked at the big trees. He thought about the men who had come back from the Second World War and the people in Washington who had set aside this land for them and then set it aside again and forgotten it. He thought about how things get lost in bureaucracies, how a person can be lost in one too, if they're not careful, if they don't insist on their own existence. He had been on the Pineview waiting list for 14 months, and nothing had moved. He had been in the forest for 3 weeks, and something had. He looked at Hatch. The dog was watching him with those steady amber eyes. "You found it," Earl said. Hatch's tail moved slowly. "9 years, and you still surprise me," Earl said. Hatch got up and came and pressed his head against Earl's chest. Earl put both arms around the dog. He held on. The light was going golden in the firs. A Steller's jay landed on the porch railing and looked at them both for a moment and then flew back into the forest. The trees held the evening light for a long time before they gave it up. By spring, the station looked different. Tolliver had been as good as his word. He had come twice with 2 of his men, quietly on weekends, and they had replaced 3 of the worst porch boards and re-chinked the worst gaps in the log walls and put new flashing on the chimney. They had refused payment. Earl had fed them lunch both times, soup and bread made on the wood stove, and that had seemed to be the agreed transaction. Pat from the library came up once with her husband, the BLM man, who walked the land with Earl for 2 hours looking at the old survey stakes, noting what was still there, what was not, making records that Carver had asked for. Her husband's name was Dennis, and he knew federal land history the way Earl knew old-growth forest, and the 2 of them talked for hours without running out of things to say, which had not happened to Earl in a long time. A man from the local VFW post drove up in April on a tip from James Pryor and sat with Earl on the porch for an afternoon. His name was Frank, and he was in his late 60s, and he had a methodical mind. He had been looking at the designation documents Carver had shared, and he had thoughts about what the land could mean if the claim came through. Not just for Earl, for other veterans in the county who were where Earl had been in October, 2 boxes on a sidewalk and nowhere to go. Earl listened. He did not say yes to anything. He was not a man who said yes quickly, but he listened. The legal process moved slowly the way these things do. Carver filed and refiled and corresponded with offices in Portland and Washington, and once drove to Washington himself for a meeting that lasted 4 hours. He called Earl every 2 or 3 weeks with updates that were mostly small and procedural. Earl appreciated the calls. He appreciated being kept in the picture. He did not demand more than Carver could give. He trusted the man's competence and let him work. On a morning in late May, Earl stood at the well and pumped water into a bucket for the kitchen garden he had put in along the south side of the station. Tomatoes, beans, a long row of peas along a string trellis. His hip was better in the warm weather. He moved without the hitch that winter had put in him. The forest around the clearing was in full leaf, the understory thick and green, ferns unfurled to full size, the little creek at the bottom of the bench running clear and steady over the stones. He could hear it from the garden. He had not been able to hear it in winter. Hatch lay in the cleared space beside the garden and watched Earl water. The dog's muzzle was very gray now in the morning light. He moved more slowly than he had in October, but he was well. He ate well. He slept long and solid. He got up every morning and made his slow circuit of the clearing perimeter, nose down, checking the borders the way he always had. Earl's job, the dog's job. They had always understood each other on this. That morning, Earl found a small wooden plank on the porch that had not been there the evening before. Someone had come up in the night or early morning and left it. On the plank, burned in with a wood-burning iron, were the words, District 7, and below that, in smaller letters, still standing. Earl picked it up and looked at it. He did not know who had left it. He would ask around. But he stood on the porch of the ranger station in the May morning light with the plank in his hands and the big firs around him and the sound of the creek below, and he felt something that had been very thin in him for a long time grow a little thicker and a little stronger. He hung the plank on the door above the old painted sign. He stood back and looked at it. Hatch came and sat beside him and looked at it too. Earl put his hand on the dog's back. They stood there together in the morning light. The forest was quiet around them. The trees were very old and very tall, and they had been here long before either of them, and they would be here long after. Earl did not find that sad. He found it steady. He found it the way he had always found the forest, which was like something solid under him, something he could put his weight on, something that would hold. If this story moved you, or if it reminded you of someone who never quite got what they were owed, leave a comment. Even just a 0 or a 1 tells me you were here. And if you'd like to walk with us into the next story, hit subscribe. We'll be right here.